Welcome to a story that doesn't just touch your heart, it unlocks it. This isn't just about age. This is about rediscovering the kind of love that reaches down into your soul and pulls you back to life. She didn't chase it. She had already let it go until one knock, one look, one unexpected connection shattered everything she thought was behind her. In these next moments, you'll witness how loneliness turned into longing, how silence was broken by a kiss, and how surrender felt more like awakening. This is a love story for every woman who thought her time had passed, and for every heart that still believes in unexpected miracles. If you've ever needed to believe in deep soul-filling love again, you're in the right place, so settle in. This is where true love comes home. Loneliness didn't come loudly. It wasn't a scream or a crash. It was quiet. It moved in like fog at dawn, soft and unnoticed at first, until everything was coated in silence. It came slowly over years, not in one heartbreak, but in many tiny goodbyes, a touch less frequent, a kiss more routine, a glance that passed right through her like she wasn't there, and soon even the mirror stopped reflecting who she once was. At first, it was just the space beside her in bed. Then it was the untouched coffee cup on the other side of the kitchen table. Then the long walks that used to be shared turned into silent loops around the block with only her own footsteps for company. There were no more hands reaching for her, no eyes searching her face with hunger or wonder, no voice saying her name like it meant something. The world didn't shatter, it faded. She still lived, still breathed, still smiled politely at neighbors, but that deep, bone-deep feeling of being wanted, needed, that had slipped out the back door years ago and never returned. Her body still remembered what it was like to be held like a secret, to be touched like a prayer, but memory and reality are two very different kinds of warmth. One lingers, the other leaves you colder after it's gone. She had made peace with it, or so she told herself. She had buried the ache under busy days and quiet evenings. Books replaced conversation, wine replaced laughter, and the touch of soft cotton sheets replaced the weight of another body beside hers. It was easier to numb than to need, easier to accept than to hope, because hope for her had become dangerous. It made her feel foolish, like a woman standing barefoot in the snow, waiting for spring that wasn't coming. One evening, the sky outside her window had turned the color of bruised plum, the kind of sky that makes you remember things you've tried hard to forget. She was folding laundry routine, quiet, safe, when the knock came. Soft 3 short taps, not loud, not demanding, just present. She almost didn't answer. The world rarely knocked for her anymore, but when she opened the door, the chill from outside wasn't the thing that stole her breath. It was the eyes staring back at her. Young, yes, but not naive. Eyes that didn't flinch. Eyes that didn't drift away in disinterest like so many others had learned to do when they looked at her. No, these eyes held her gaze like it was the only thing worth looking at. He said her name, not formally, not awkwardly, like it belonged to him, like he had been saying it quietly to himself for a long time. There was something strange in the air then, a kind of stillness. Not awkwardness, but awareness. She felt it like static on her skin, that subtle, breathless moment when something begins, even if you don't understand what it is yet. His voice didn't ask for anything. It just landed, warm, steady, honest. She invited him in without thinking. She told herself it was kindness, habit, but her body knew different. Her body had started to hum, like an old violin brought out of storage. Dusty, forgotten, but not broken. They talked about nothing at first. Weather, the neighborhood, books, the kind of talk that floats just above the surface. But even then, something deeper moved beneath his words. His questions weren't casual. They were crafted, as if he was listening not just to what she said, but what she didn't, and she noticed things. The way he leaned forward, never away. The way he smiled, not to charm, but to reassure. The way his eyes lingered at the corners of her lips when she spoke, as if memorizing her every word. He didn't look at her like she was older or wiser or a memory of who she used to be. He looked at her like she was here, present, whole, seen. For the first time in years, her laugh came from her stomach, not her throat, and when she did, he smiled in a way that made her feel noticed, desired even, not in a hungry way, not in a desperate way, but in that rare, reverent way, as if she were something he'd hoped to find and couldn't believe he had. Days turned into weeks, conversations deepened, silence no longer felt empty, it felt shared, and every time he showed up, the air in her lungs felt a little lighter. Her hands moved more gracefully, her eyes searched the mirror with less apology. She had stopped asking why, a long time ago, why love faded, why passion left, why her skin had become invisible to the world. But now she was asking different questions. Why he saw her, why it felt so natural to want again, why her heart began to stretch toward him in quiet, aching ways. He never rushed her. He never needed to. What grew between them was not wild. It was steady, grounded, honest, and when his hand finally brushed hers, it wasn't a fire. It was a match lit in the dark, small, simple, enough to remind her that warmth was still possible. And when she let his lips find hers, something deep inside cracked, not from pain, but from release. A part of her she thought had died, exhaled. Her body leaned forward before her mind could stop it. And that kiss wasn't about lust. It was about memory and resurrection. He didn't ask her to be anything other than what she was. He didn't ask her to be younger, smaller, softer. He wanted her as she was. And in his arms, she didn't feel older. She felt alive. Not everyone would understand. Not everyone needed to. Because for the first time in decades, she wasn't waiting for the cold to end. She had opened the door, and spring had walked in. He didn't just see a woman standing in a doorway. He saw something else, something quieter, something people don't usually notice unless they're looking with more than just their eyes. He saw a soul, still guarded but aching to be seen. Not for who she was once, or who she had to become to survive, but for who she still was, beneath everything time had taken and everything life had made her forget. She didn't expect much when she opened the door. A package maybe, a question from a neighbor, just another moment that would pass without leaving a mark. But the moment didn't pass, it settled, like a soft, slow wind that moves through you instead of around you. His eyes didn't flicker away like most. They didn't glance at the lines around hers or hesitate over the years on her face. No, they held her. They searched, not in judgment, but in recognition. Like he'd seen her before in a dream he couldn't quite remember. Like he had been waiting for this moment without realizing it until it stood right in front of him. She felt it before she understood it. That pull, that shift, it wasn't loud. It was a slow unraveling of something she didn't know was still inside her. A lock slowly turning, not forced, just ready. He asked if she remembered him, and she did vaguely. He used to help the neighbors mow their lawn when he was younger. He was just a boy then, and now he wasn't. His voice had depth, his posture had weight, his presence had grown into something quiet and commanding. They talked just for a moment, but it was never just a moment. It stretched, expanded, because everything in his eyes said this wasn't about small talk. This was about something unspoken, something already happening, even if neither of them said it out loud. She didn't know why she invited him in. Maybe she was curious, maybe she was lonely, maybe it was the way his gaze never once made her feel invisible. Maybe it was the way he leaned into her words like they mattered. He sat at her kitchen table like he'd always belonged there. Nothing was rushed, nothing was asked for, but his attention. It wrapped around her like a whisper. She could feel it, how closely he watched her hands when she poured the tea, how his smile lingered when she laughed, like he wanted to memorize the sound, and underneath all of it there was hunger, not the obvious kind. Not the kind that demands. This was deeper, slower, like he had discovered something he didn't know he needed, like something about her presence settled something restless in him. She hadn't felt that in years. She hadn't realized how numb she had become until she wasn't anymore. The air between them shifted, gently, like a tide rolling in, not dangerous, not fast, but inevitable. He listened to her in a way that made her feel full again. Whole. He didn't fill the silences with meaningless noise. He let them exist, let them breathe, and in those silences, she felt something building, connection without pressure, desire without force, intimacy without demand. She watched the way his eyes flicked to her lips when she spoke, then back to her eyes. The way he didn't flinch at the tears that sometimes caught in her throat when she talked about the past. He didn't pity her. He understood her, and that was everything. One evening, after he'd stopped by to return a book, their hands brushed, not by accident, not dramatically, just brushed. His fingers grazed hers, and neither of them pulled away. She looked up, and there it was, that same steady gaze, not asking, not assuming, just holding her in it. And for the first time in a very long time, she didn't look away. It wasn't the touch that undid her. It was the silence that followed, heavy, honest, and full of meaning. Her heart beat differently after that, slower but stronger, as if it had remembered something it thought it would never feel again. He didn't rush her, he didn't push, but his presence stayed in her home, in her thoughts, in the places where emptiness used to live. She began to see herself differently, not because he told her she was beautiful, though he did. Not because he touched her gently, though he did that too, but because, through him, she remembered what it felt like to matter again, to be wanted not out of convenience, but out of choice. His visits became a rhythm, a pulse in her week, not predictable but natural. Sometimes he brought her coffee. Sometimes they said very little. Sometimes she'd find herself laughing too loudly at something simple, and he would smile like that was all he ever needed. There was a night it rained, hard, the kind of rain that drums on the windows like a heartbeat. He was there, and so was she, and so was that tension, the soft kind that doesn't frighten you, the kind that holds you. He reached for her hand. She didn't pull away. She didn't speak either. She just let the moment be what it was, quiet, real, and true. There was nothing loud about what was happening, nothing dramatic. Just two souls finding each other again in a world that had forgotten how to look. And as she sat beside him, fingers laced with his, the years fell away, not erased but softened, like snow melting in spring. And in that silence, she knew sometimes, love doesn't knock at the door. Sometimes it stands there patiently, waiting for you to be ready to open it. When he kissed her, it wasn't just lips and skin. It was something deeper, something that moved through her like a slow, quiet fire. It was the kind of kiss that doesn't ask permission. It waits for your heart to open on its own, then walks through like it always belonged there. It didn't feel new. It felt like a memory coming back to life. She hadn't been kissed like that in years, not just kissed, but held in a moment, seen in it. She didn't realize how much of herself had gone silent until that silence shattered with his mouth on hers. The world didn't stop, but something inside her did, something that had been moving on autopilot for too long. The ache in her chest wasn't pain, it was recognition. He didn't rush. There was no desperation in his hands, just certainty, a kind of knowing, like every place he touched had been waiting, like every inch of her skin had been holding its breath, and now it could finally exhale. His fingers traced her jaw, not to possess her, but to feel her, to remind her she still had warmth, she still had softness. Her body wasn't something to be hidden behind layers of routine and silence. It was still hers. It still responded. It still remembered. She trembled, not from fear, but from awakening, from the sudden return of feeling in places she thought had gone numb. It wasn't lust that overwhelmed her. It was emotion, raw, heavy, beautiful emotion, the kind that makes your throat tighten and your heart pound and your eyes sting. When he touched her face, it was with reverence. When he ran his hand down her arm, it wasn't to provoke, it was to invite. Each gesture asked a question she hadn't heard in years. Do you remember who you were before you gave up? Before the years wore you down, before love became a faded memory and not a living thing. She remembered, not all at once, but in pieces. The way his breath mixed with hers brought back the girl who once danced barefoot in the rain. The woman who used to sing to herself while cooking. The dreamer who used to believe that touch wasn't something you had to earn or fear losing. It was something sacred, shared, needed. His mouth moved slowly across her skin, like he wasn't just kissing her, he was discovering her, learning her, and every time she let herself respond, every soft sigh, every involuntary shiver, it felt like a thread tying her back to herself. She hadn't looked at her own body with softness in so long. The mirror had become something to avoid. She'd learned to dress in ways that hid instead of celebrated. But now, under his gaze, she didn't feel hidden. She felt unveiled, not exposed, seen. He kissed her shoulder like it was made of something delicate. He traced the inside of her wrist like it held a secret. Every part of her he touched. He did so with care. Not like she was fragile, but like she mattered. She didn't speak. She couldn't. Her voice stayed caught in her throat. But her hands answered him. They wrapped around his back, not to pull him closer, but to feel that he was real, that this moment wasn't slipping away, that she wasn't dreaming. And when their bodies finally settled against each other, clothed in heat, draped in silence, it didn't feel like surrender. It felt like remembering, like her body had been waiting for this, for the return of softness, of presence, of meaning. There were tears in her eyes, and he didn't wipe them away. He let them fall, let them be there. Like he understood they weren't sadness, they were relief, years of it, built up, finally finding release. She didn't feel young again. That wasn't the point. She felt alive, whole, like every year had led to this moment, not as a second chance, but as proof that she had never truly been forgotten. That love hadn't stopped being possible. She had just stopped expecting it. He looked at her after, and there was no triumph in his eyes, just tenderness, and maybe something else, gratefulness, because she wasn't the only one who needed this. The connection, the truth, the slow rediscovery of something sacred. They didn't speak much that night. Words would have been too small, too simple, but when he kissed her again, just once, softly on the forehead, it said everything. You're still here. You still matter. You are still beautiful. And as she lay there beside him, breathing slowly, the silence returned. But it wasn't empty anymore. It was full of everything she thought she'd lost. Full of everything she didn't know she could feel again. She closed her eyes and let it hold her, because for the first time in years, she wasn't just touched, she was remembered. Love didn't rush in like thunder. It came quietly, softly, not as a spark, but as a steady, undeniable warmth that crept into her chest and filled the spaces where loneliness had lived for too long. It wasn't something she chased. It found her in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, when her guard was down and the world outside her window had long stopped asking anything of her heart. She had opened the door expecting a simple visit. A neighbor, a delivery, a question. What she got was something far more complicated, far more beautiful. A man standing there not just looking at her, but seeing her, like she wasn't invisible, like she wasn't past her season, like she still carried something worth pausing for. She didn't plan to let anyone in, but he didn't step into her home the way most people do. He stepped into her presence with patience, with eyes that didn't scan but stayed, with a silence that didn't press but welcomed. It disarmed her. It made her forget the reasons she'd built walls in the first place. And when they sat across from each other, two mugs between them, something in her shifted. It wasn't fireworks. It wasn't that dizzying kind of chemistry they write about in books. It was something gentler, something real, like her soul had been wandering for years and finally sat down for the first time. He didn't talk much, but when he did, it was without performance. There was no arrogance in his voice, no need to impress. He asked her about her garden, her books, her favorite season. He listened like her words weren't just sounds, they were stories worth holding. And slowly, so slowly, she began to open, not all at once, but piece by piece, the small, guarded smiles, the glance that lingered half a second longer than it should have, the moment her fingers brushed his while passing a cup, and she didn't pull away. Love, real love, didn't knock her over. It undid her quietly, with gentle hands and honest eyes. It was surrender, not to him, but to herself, to the woman she hadn't let breathe in years, the woman buried under routines, responsibilities, old wounds, and fading mirrors. He never asked her to be anything other than what she was in that moment. He didn't reach for her out of impulse or impatience. He moved with intention. Every word, every pause, every inch of space he closed between them was filled with awareness. Not of her age, her past, or what the world might say, but of her presence, her energy, the ache behind her smile and the depth behind her eyes. And when they lay together for the first time, there was no awkwardness. No apologies for stretch marks or silence or years gone by. He didn't worship her like a fantasy. He held her like a truth, like someone who had been waiting without knowing it, for this exact skin, this exact breath. This moment, there was no performance, no need to prove youth or reclaim time. It wasn't about age. It wasn't about what had been lost. It was about what had survived her. She hadn't been touched in years, not like that. Not in a way that asked nothing and gave everything. His hands weren't demanding. They didn't treat her like a relic. They treated her like something sacred, something still alive. Every breath they shared felt like a prayer. Every glance like a confession. She hadn't expected to feel beautiful again. She hadn't expected to feel seen. But there, in that quiet room, wrapped in nothing but truth and warmth, she was both. She didn't think about tomorrow, or what it meant, or what would come next. For once, her mind wasn't a storm. It was still, present. Her body wasn't something to fix or hide. It was something to feel, and she let herself feel it all. His heart beat against hers, his voice soft against her ear, the way he held her after, not possessive, not protective, just present. And she realized this wasn't survival anymore. This was life, real, trembling breath, catching heart, opening life. Not the kind that makes headlines, the kind that changes you quietly, that rewrites the narrative you've been telling yourself for too long, that whispers, "You're not too late," because she wasn't. She was right on time. And so was he. There was no script, no fairy tale, just two souls colliding at the edge of a moment they didn't plan, but both needed. And in that room, lit by nothing more than the softness of dusk and the sound of two hearts finally letting go, something broke open. Not just her body, her spirit. It uncurled from years of silence and stood up, not to be anyone's fantasy, but to be real, to be felt, to be loved, not in spite of the years, but because of the woman they had shaped. And she let herself be that woman, not hiding, not apologizing, just there, fully, finally, and in his arms. She didn't just remember who she was, she became her again. If this story touched something real inside you, don't leave without hitting like, subscribing, and turning on the bell. There's more where this came from. More true love, more soul, more awakening. Let love find you here.